In this edition of our panel discussion, we touch upon the economic repercussions of Russia's military campaign in Ukraine. For more, I have Professor Song Soo-young from Chungang University. Professor Song, it's a pleasure to have you here.
Yeah, thank you for inviting me.
I also have Professor Oh Jin-seok from Sookmyung Women's University. Professor Oh, welcome back.
Thank you for having me.
Professor Song, we'll start with you then. Let's begin with the reaction of global financial markets to Russia's invasion of Ukraine.
Yeah, overall, the capital market remains relatively, even though despite some short-term reaction against the breakout of the Ukraine and Russian war, but relatively they remain comparably recover what it used to be. But overall, the tendency between the difference between the U.S. market, U.S. and Japanese market, and the European market is distinctive. The reason is because U.S. and Japan has experienced some downward trend for the past 3 months, but in the U.K. It has shown that some upward trending, but it is disrupted shortly because of the war. But in the long run, I believe that the capital market recovers well, and what is important would be the long-term inflation effect, or that it would be the most important factor. So
right.
The war itself is not currently war is not some long-term factor at all.
Right, and we'll touch upon inflation in a bit, of course. Professor O, the international community for its part has responded with sanctions, but some are casting doubt on the actual impact of these punitive measures. How do you explain these doubts?
Sanctions put in place by the United States cut off all individuals and entities from the American financial system, which means they cannot do any business in the American financial system. And then under U.S. jurisdictions, all the assets are frozen. But as Sonny commented, that in spite of these kind of sanctions, there is a kind of doubt that the effect might be less painful or less effective in three respects. First, the Russian economy, Russia was used to sanction, has been prepared for sanctions. And for example, Silver Bank, Russia's biggest bank, has reportedly been testing its ability to survive without access to the Western software. It also has hundreds of billions of foreign reserves in the National Wealth Fund. Second is the relation with the EU. The EU relationship with Russia is one of interdependence, which means they cannot continue their full-scale collusion to the end. The EU procures 40% of gas from Russian supply, and at the same time, Russia also rely heavily on their energy export, 30% of its economy, and then more than 60% of export to the EU. Lastly, which is the most important, China take the arbitration diplomacy will that support for Russia. We already know that Russia needs China as an allied partner. And think about the United States and China. They has been in a trade battle. So it is right timing for China to level up their negotiation power by supporting the Russian economy in a sense that might be they will supply Russia, block the importing goods, and so on. As a result, the price of Chinese yuan, it might be soaring up. There is nothing to be hesitated for China under these situations.
Right, I see. And Professor Song, Korea for its part has also condemned Russia's brutal operation in Ukraine and has pledged to adopt relevant sanctions. Tell us a bit more about the sanctions that Korea seeks to adopt.
Korea is just to participate as an international member of the United Nations, and so the best strategy for the Korean government is to remain relatively neutral and not to be ostensibly should not lead the sanctions against. Anyway, the United States and the EU countries will be in the front runner. So as for the sanctions imposed currently on the Russia, the FDPL, which is a foreign direct product rule, which was imposed for the first time against the Chinese telecommunication company Huawei, it has reported that to have incurred some loss of revenue profit for almost 30% for Huawei telecommunication company. But whether it is effective against Russia is in doubt. So because Russia has some other alternative way to be accessible to the international payment and settlement system, and such as a financial messaging system, such as, for example, the SWIFT, even though they are cut off from the SWIFT, which is a Society for Worldwide Interbank Financial Telecommunication. So that is just not the payment settlement system, but the financial telecommunication system. So even though they have some alternative route through China, and also, as Professor O mentioned, that Russians' exports relies on energy sector. So, but interdependence between the world economy and Russia is very deep. And also, from Korea's perspective, actually, the Russian oil or Russian petroleum, that is the very cheapest source of the import. So relatively cheaper than Western Texas Intermediate from U.S. and Middle Eastern countries from such as Saudi Arabia. Therefore, Korea might suffer from a little bit surge of the oil price relatively, but it doesn't last long. I don't expect to last long. So anyway, I hope the war is over soon.
Right, of course. And keeping in mind the repercussions that Professor Song has highlighted for the local economy, Professor, what measures are being discussed to perhaps limit the ripple effects of such sanctions on the corporate sector here?
Korean government made it clear in an announcement that it will participate in the economic sanction to deter the armed aggression and then resolve peacefully the matter like this. And the announcement followed sanction from the United States on Russian banks, and then after from Germany tried to froze the gas project with Russia. And even the European Union announced to impose bans on Russian aircraft and the state-owned media outlet, along with the lethal assistance, the amount of 450 million euros. Now it is time to design a kind of decisive action plan. And so Washington wants Korea Washington demanded Korea restrict its export control, especially for kind of industrial item specialized in semiconductors and then automobiles and technology embedded items, which will have a corrosive effect on the development of the Russian industry and the military. Korean government, as Sonny mentioned, have to prepare some kind of measures to minimize this kind of expected damages for Korean companies. We already know that the Korean companies invested in Ukraine, as the Samsung Electronics, LG Electronics, Hyundai, POSCO International, Hankook Tire, and Ecovis, and so on. It is also true there are Koreans and then Korean companies in Russia with trade with Russia also on the rise. So thinking about this, then there are many factors to be counted on. But at this moment, it is to the point for Korea. We have to focus more on the Ukraine community, how to support and embrace the wounded and trusted partners. Not to mention of diplomatic support for Ukraine, Korean government have to consider the idea of supporting such non-lethal assistance as the necessity, consumption goods, and providing kind of medical assistance to Ukraine.
Right, it does. Meanwhile, Professor Song, you mentioned oil prices, which soared above $100 a barrel in early trade on this Monday, in response to Russian President Vladimir Putin's raising of the country's nuclear alert level. What are your prospects with regard to the global oil market?
As for the global oil market, once the war is over, then because we have witnessed the plunge of the currency ruble, Russian currency ruble. So combined together with, and also once war is over, that Russian economy needs to recover the economy what it used to be. So they have to produce more oil. Therefore, combined together with that, the oil price will go down definitely in the long run. But once the war has been extended too long, that might have some negative impact of the supply disruption is extended. Therefore, that is the problem. But as for the oil price, I do not much problem in the future. But it depends upon the time whether the war is over in the relatively short time or if it is extended longer. And also, as for the Putin's some mention about the nuclear alert, and that is like some exaggeration. And I don't think it will be, because once it started and it is a devastating effect is all over the world. So that is really unnecessary damage on the both sides, and also even China do not want that. So I think that because of that, I don't think it will be a really effective threat, and it will be. I don't think it will be materialized in the future.
Right, hopefully not. Professor, ultimately soaring oil prices will aggravate global inflation. What are your prospects on this front, especially for the local economy?
No wonder it will be a hard hit for the short time. There might be two reasons. As Professor Song commented about the supply disruption, first I'd like to raise the matter of supply instability. Russia is the world's #1 natural gas exporter, and then Ukraine is called bread basket of Europe. Think about it, military conflicts between these two countries might generate supply instability of energy and grain, which is essential for our daily living. And second thing I'd like to comment about is financial volatility. There is a doubt over whether the Korean government might keep its interest rate, keep the growing rate of consumer price at a target rate of 2%. Last year, consumer price growth 2.5%. That is the highest since 2011. Bank of Korea last month raised its outlook for this year's consumer price increase 2% and then updated to 2.5%. And then thinking about this kind of military tension, it will over 3%. It is reasonably expected for Bank of Korea to increase interest rate consecutively to control the inflationary pressure. What Korean companies not to forget to count in their decision making is that due to the volatility of this kind of interest rate changes, it will be affected to the foreign exchange market volatility, which means that the financial market, I mean the international capital movements in and out rapidly, and then which will make an ill effect on the foreign exchange rate volatility, increase the foreign exchange rate volatility. So it is time to think about and then check the trend of the foreign exchange rate changes, especially targeted for the Chinese yuan and the US dollar volatility might be of great danger.
Right. Professor Song, Professor O just mentioned Seoul Central Bank's benchmark interest rate. Now, last month, the central bank kept its interest rate unchanged at 1.25%. What do you believe was behind this particular move?
If the Bank of Korea has raised interest rate, it would be some 3 consecutive interest rate hike. So that is the speed was too fast. So that needs some kind of moderation. And also, what is important in the United States, the federal funds rate is expected to be increased for 4 times in this year or 6 times or whatever the expectation. That should depend upon the inflation expectation is embedded or anchored within the people's mind in the US. But when we look at this data about this 10-year long-term bond, the government issued bond, treasury bond, particularly TIPS, the Treasury Inflation Protection Securities, we could find some inflation expectation from those, the price change, then the yield remains constant. Even it is slightly. So that tells us that in the long run, the consumers and the peoples expect inflation rate will be decreased over time or remain constant over time. So that tells us that, but the problem is how long is that? So clearly that is a 10-year range, and the 5-year also relatively stable, but in the 1 year that is very high. So to that regard, that even the United States, they have experienced such a very high inflation rate in the last December and September, and also actually the unemployment, the NAIRU, so non-accelerated inflation rate of the unemployment has been already surpassed in the last September. That is some kind of hindsight, because without the data, it is very difficult to make an assessment about that. So to that regard, the United States economy is already on the very the full employment status. But right now for Korea, we are not sure about that. Therefore, we need to adjust the increasing rate for the time being, and we have to wait until, because we are affected too much from the breakout of war and some oil price and the natural gas energy sectors plays a very important role in Korean economy's destiny for the future. Therefore, we need some prudential and prudent approach for the interest rate hike.
Right.
That's why.
Right, and staying with that interest rate, Professor, what are your thoughts with regard to the central bank's future course of action amid the rampant geopolitical concerns mentioned by Professor Song and, of course, the presence of Omicron here in the country?
Professor Song comment about the long-term and the short-term perspective. I'd like to focus on the short-term focused. And then there is a theory about the purchasing power parity, which means that when there happens an overall price increase, I mean the inflation rate, there is a link with the capital market turbulence. So when there happens such drastic changes of inflationary expectation, it will cause the capital market in turbulence. So think about it, the military conflicts between Russia and Ukraine, and then Russia, when Russia moves the energy price increase, which will result in the production cost increase. And then when they're thinking about the Ukraine economy, the cost of grain, I mean the cost of food increase, then if you are consumers, and then out of your total purchasing power, then due to the production cost increase and then food cost increase, then there's not much thing left to consume. So as a result, accordingly, production will decrease for the short term, and then eventually they will reduce the investment level and then reduce the employment level accordingly. And then another theory is about inflation gap. Inflation gap is related with the interest rate changes, and then due to this kind of interest rate changes, will be affected too, and then amplifying the foreign exchange rate changes wider. So according to this rule, that I think about it, as Professor Song commented about the 30 times consecutive interest rates changes are expected. Then when there happens interest rate changes, then it will amplify the foreign exchange rate changes to a wider ranges. So again, then we have to focus more on the trend and analyze the condition of foreign exchange market.
Right. Perhaps, Professor Song, we could end with a few words from you with regard to ways to perhaps better prepare for a prolonged outbreak of warfare in Ukraine.
Because the trade, Croatia is the 12th or 10th ranked trade partner with Korea. And Korea has imported so much energy sectors such as coal, oil, and oil-related products, and also some natural gas. And the 5th ranked is, to my surprise, it was crustacean. So it means the fishery. But as for that, so we have a huge trade deficit against Russia, but it is very important line of economy. So we have to maintain the relationship relatively moderate, try not to sever or not to separate Russia totally at all, because Russia is a very important partner. And also, I would like to raise an old age tells us that avoid the rain when it is torrential. So that is the best strategy. And in the long run, the Korean economy has managed well and survived this kind of some geopolitical crisis.
Right, I see. All right, Professor Song, as always, thank you very much for your thoughts today. Professor Oh, thank you very much for your insights.
Thank you.